It was a crisp Thursday evening in the heart of Portland, Oregon, and the velvet-lit atmosphere of Café Amarillo buzzed softly with the warmth of conversation and the subtle clinking of silverware. Inside, surrounded by exposed brick and vintage chandeliers, the air carried the scent of rosemary bread and slow-roasted herbs, while a soft instrumental guitar played in the background. Among the staff was a woman named Camille, 29 years old, with a composed expression and eyes that held stories she rarely told. Her long chestnut hair was pulled into a tidy braid, and her crisp white shirt bore a name tag she often forgot she wore. To the guests, Camille was a server like any other, efficient, polite, forgettable. But few knew that she had once dreamed of composing music for film, of hearing her melodies echo through theaters. Life, however, had different ideas. Camille had grown up in a rural part of Montana, raised by her grandfather, a retired truck mechanic with a love for old records and jazz improvisation. He couldn't read music, but he taught her rhythm using pots and pans, and later gifted her a second-hand keyboard he'd fixed up himself. That instrument became her lifeline. At night, while other kids stayed up scrolling on their phones, Camille would close her eyes and let her fingers tell stories. She never studied formally, but she learned to write music by ear, copying pieces from soundtracks she recorded off the TV. Her dream was to one day score a film that made someone cry, not out of sadness, but because they saw themselves in the sound. But dreams like those don't pay rent. When her grandfather passed, Camille moved to the city and took whatever work she could find. Café Amarillo was her third job in 2 years, and although she rarely spoke of it, she had chosen it not for the tips or location, but because of the baby grand piano tucked discreetly in the corner of the dining room. It was rarely used, more decoration than instrument, but to Camille, just knowing it was there brought comfort. Some nights, when the shift was slow and no one was watching, she'd sit and play for a few minutes, always stopping the moment footsteps approached. That evening was uneventful until the door swung open with theatrical flair. In stepped Dorian Holt, a wealthy venture capitalist with slicked-back hair and a voice as loud as his reputation. He was trailed by 2 men in designer jackets and a woman in heels that echoed with every step. Regulars turned their heads. Some recognized him from magazine covers or viral podcasts. Dorian was known not just for his investments, but for his love of public theatrics, especially at someone else's expense. When he spoke, it wasn't to converse, but to command attention, and that night his attention quickly locked onto Camille. She felt his eyes on her before he even spoke. When she approached to offer them menus, he looked her over with an amused smirk, then flicked his gaze toward the piano in the corner. "Tell me," he said, his voice carrying easily through the restaurant, "does anyone ever actually use that thing?" Camille responded calmly, "Not usually, sir." He squinted at her name tag. "Camille, huh? That sounds like the name of someone who's hiding an interesting story." His tone wasn't friendly. It was performative, like he was setting up a joke only he understood. Camille gave a small nod and turned to leave, but Dorian wasn't finished. "Wait, do you play?" he asked, gesturing toward the piano. The question caught her off guard. She hesitated for a beat, then answered truthfully but softly, "I used to." The words barely left her mouth before he chuckled. "Used to. That's tragic. Life gets in the way, huh?" His guests laughed politely. Camille smiled, nodded again, and walked back to the counter. She hoped that would be the end of it, but Dorian's flair for spectacle didn't let up. Halfway through their appetizers, he clinked his glass loudly and stood. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said theatrically to the room, "we have a former artist among us. Camille here says she used to play piano, and I, for one, think lost talent deserves a spotlight." He turned to her, voice booming, "Come on, Camille, give us a taste, for old time's sake." The room stilled. Diners paused mid-conversation, unsure whether to be amused or uncomfortable. Camille froze in place. She hadn't touched a piano in front of strangers in years, and certainly not under a spotlight as artificial and mocking as this. "I really shouldn't," she said quietly, her voice nearly drowned by the awkward silence that followed. Dorian waved dismissively. "Oh, come on," he said, clearly entertained by her discomfort. "What's the harm in a little entertainment unless—" He paused, tilting his head. "You're afraid you've lost it." Camille's jaw clenched. She wasn't one to react impulsively, but something about the way he said it, the way he assumed her worth had expired, hit a nerve she hadn't felt in a long time. Memories of late-night compositions, her grandfather's old harmonica solos, and the way her heart used to race when she finished writing a melody all flashed through her mind. She took a breath, steadied her thoughts, and said, "All right, just one piece." As she moved toward the piano, a hush fell over the room. Dorian's entourage exchanged smirks, clearly expecting a disaster. Camille sat down, adjusting the bench slightly, her fingers grazing the ivory keys like greeting an old friend. She hadn't planned this, but she knew exactly what to play. The first few notes came slowly, deliberately. Then, as her confidence built, the music unfolded like a memory being retold. The piece, a composition of her own, one she'd written years ago but never shared, flowed like a secret finely given voice. The melody was tender and haunting, full of pauses that felt like breath and surges that echoed longing. It wasn't perfect. A note here or there struck slightly off. But it was raw, real, and deeply hers. By the time she struck the final chord, no one was speaking. No clinking of glasses, no whispering, just silence, and the fading vibration of truth. The final note hung in the air like the last word of a long-awaited confession. Camille's hands remained still, her fingertips lightly touching the keys as though anchoring her to the moment. The room was frozen, not with discomfort, but with reverence. The kind of hush that follows something honest, something human. Then, one by one, hands began to clap, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. A few guests stood, applauding with a kind of gratitude usually reserved for moments they didn't expect, but knew they'd remember. Camille didn't turn around immediately. She closed her eyes for 1 second longer, letting the emotions settle in her chest. This wasn't validation. It wasn't redemption. It was something deeper, a reclaiming of a part of herself she thought she had lost in the noise of life's demands. When she finally rose from the bench, her legs trembled slightly, but her spine was straight. The applause wrapped around her like a blanket. She nodded quietly to a couple seated near the front, their eyes bright with emotion, and smiled faintly. But there was one face she had yet to face: Dorian Holt. Slowly, she turned toward his table. He was seated still, elbows resting on the linen-covered surface, one hand propping up his chin. The smirk he wore earlier was absent. In its place was something else: uncertainty, as if he wasn't quite sure whether to feel impressed or outmaneuvered. That, he finally said with a slight laugh that lacked its usual confidence, was unexpected. His words were loud enough to be heard by nearby tables, but they landed flat, like a drum without tension. "You've got some fire in you, Camille." Camille didn't respond immediately. She took a moment, studying him with the same quiet focus she once reserved for composing. "I never lost it," she said calmly. "I just stopped showing it to people who weren't really listening." The ripple of her words passed through the room. It wasn't loud, it wasn't confrontational, but it was heard. Dorian's table shifted uncomfortably. One of his companions took a sudden interest in his wine glass. The woman beside him, previously giggling at his every remark, avoided Camille's eyes entirely. The power dynamic had changed, and everyone knew it. Camille walked back toward the server station, her steps more purposeful, more grounded. Her co-workers, who had watched from a distance, greeted her with small nods and wide smiles. There was no fanfare among them, only quiet solidarity. They had all known she was more than her apron. Now, so did everyone else. As the evening moved on, something had shifted in the air. Patrons who had barely noticed Camille earlier now stopped her to offer kind words. "You're incredibly gifted," said an older man as she poured his coffee. "I hope you never stop playing." A younger woman, eyes glassy with tears, added, "Your music reminded me of my sister. She passed away last year. Thank you for that." Camille responded with grace and humility, never expecting such reactions, but accepting them with quiet warmth. Dorian, on the other hand, remained subdued for the rest of the meal. His booming laugh was gone, replaced by an occasional sip of water and awkward glances around the room. Camille approached their table to deliver the check. She didn't avoid eye contact. Instead, she looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "Here's your bill, Mr. Holt," she said simply. He took it without comment. There was no witty retort, no attempt at charm, just a tight-lipped nod and a hastily scribbled signature. As they left, his group exited without the theatrical flair they had entered with. No loud goodbyes, no confident swagger, just silence and retreat. Camille watched them go, not with triumph, but with clarity. They were no longer part of the narrative that mattered. They were merely a footnote in her evening. And now, a moment just for us, the ones watching her journey unfold. If you felt something stir inside you during Camille's story, maybe a memory, maybe a dream you've hidden away, then I want to ask you something. What's the piano in your life that you've been walking past? Is there something you once loved that you've put on a shelf telling yourself it wasn't the right time? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your story, because this channel isn't just about watching stories, it's about sharing them too. And hey, if this moment spoke to you, if it made you pause, reflect, or even tear up a little, why not hit that subscribe button? Not because you have to, but because this space is where we honor resilience, and maybe the next story will be yours. Camille stepped outside during her short break, the evening air brushing against her skin, like a reminder that life moved on, regardless of what had just unfolded inside the cafe. She leaned against the brick wall near the delivery entrance, exhaling slowly. Her fingers still tingled from the performance, but it wasn't nerves anymore. It was release. For years, she had buried that part of herself so deeply that even she started to believe it was gone. And yet, tonight, under fluorescent lights and the scrutiny of strangers, it had returned like it had never left. She didn't need permission to be who she was. She never had. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket, a message from her roommate, Grace. "Someone just posted a video of you playing, girl. You're blowing up." Camille blinked. Video. Her heart skipped. She opened the link Grace sent and saw herself, framed by the soft glow of chandeliers, lost in the keys. It had already been shared dozens of times, the comments pouring in. Who is she? Why does this feel like the soundtrack to my childhood? Crying at Café Amarillo over here. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry, maybe both. She locked her screen, suddenly overwhelmed. Back inside, her co-workers greeted her with grins that felt like old friends. Matteo, who usually kept to himself, offered her a small fist bump. "Didn't know we had a rock star hiding in plain sight," he said. Camille chuckled, brushing it off. But deep down, something was beginning to shift. Not ego, not fame, just a subtle awareness that she no longer had to shrink to fit into places that couldn't hold her whole self. Later that night, as the cafe neared closing, Camille found a quiet moment to breathe. The last few customers lingered over dessert, and the soft clink of cutlery echoed like a lullaby through the nearly empty dining room. She glanced over at the piano, still gleaming, still waiting. She considered playing again, but this time not to prove anything, just because it was hers. Then came a tap on her shoulder. A man in his early 40s, wearing a blue corduroy jacket and kind eyes, smiled awkwardly. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he began, holding a business card between his fingers. "I was here earlier. You played something unforgettable." Camille offered a small smile, unsure what to say. "I'm Everett," he continued, handing her the card. "I work with a small independent studio in Seattle. We help local composers build portfolios. We're not big, but we believe in talent that moves people. I'd love to talk if you're open to it." Camille stared at the card, then at him, not quite believing what she was hearing. He wasn't offering dreams wrapped in glitter or promises too grand to trust, just a step, an invitation, a door cracked open. She took the card, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you," she said, the words steady and sincere. "I'd like that." After he left, she stood still for a long moment, staring at the small rectangle in her hand, as if it might dissolve if she blinked. But it didn't. It remained real, and so did the possibility it carried. The night finally wound down, and as she helped wipe down tables and stack chairs, Camille moved slower, deliberately. Each motion felt more intentional, like she was no longer rushing through invisibility, but instead inhabiting her space fully. The echoes of the applause, the warmth of the piano's resonance, the unexpected kindness of strangers, all of it lingered like background music to her thoughts. She left the cafe around midnight. The streets were quiet, the glow of the lampposts casting long shadows on the wet pavement. She walked with her headphones in, not listening to anything, just using them to cocoon herself in the afterglow of the night. In her mind, the music still played. Not the piece she performed earlier, but a new melody beginning to form, fragmented and raw, but hers. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she didn't feel the usual weight of exhaustion. She felt awake, not in the way caffeine makes you jittery, but in the way hope stirs your bones. Grace was waiting inside, a bowl of leftover pasta in hand and a gleam in her eye. "Okay, so you're officially famous," she teased, turning her phone screen toward Camille. "Your video's got over 20,000 views, and that's just on one account." Camille dropped her bag and let out a quiet laugh. "That's insane." Grace shook her head, smiling. "It's not. It's what happens when someone finally sees you." Camille sat at their old, slightly out-of-tune upright piano by the window. It wasn't much, but it had carried her through lonely nights and writer's block. She placed her hands on the keys and played, not to perfect anything, but just to feel the sound echo through the small room. Grace sat cross-legged on the couch, eating in silence, the tune filling the air between them, like the start of something neither could quite name yet. The days that followed were a strange blend of ordinary and extraordinary. Camille still woke up to the buzzing alarm, still rode the same crowded bus, still tied her apron behind her back and greeted customers with the same practiced warmth. But beneath the surface, everything had shifted. Every now and then, someone would stop her mid-shift and say, "Hey, you're that girl from the video, or that song." I still can't stop thinking about it. Some handed her notes, others just offered a quiet smile. They weren't looking at her as a server anymore. They were seeing her, but it wasn't the attention that changed her. It was the realization that her voice, her true voice, could carry beyond the walls she thought confined it. She started playing more often at home, not hiding, not hesitating, sketching melodies again, writing them down in the weathered notebook she'd abandoned years ago. Grace noticed it too. "You're different," she said one night as they sat on the couch sipping tea. "Not in a bad way. Just like you're remembering who you are." Camille nodded, her gaze distant but focused. "It's like I've been holding my breath for years, and now I finally exhaled." Meanwhile, the video continued to spread, finding its way into places Camille couldn't imagine. A local arts blog wrote a short piece titled, "When a Café Became a Concert Hall." Then a radio host mentioned her story during a morning segment. The clip reached musicians, students, dreamers, and even a few educators. Messages came pouring in through Grace's Instagram, since Camille had never bothered with her own social media presence. One message stood out, a middle school teacher from Iowa who said she played Camille's video for her students during music class. "You reminded them that art doesn't need a stage to be powerful," she wrote. "Thank you for that." Camille read the message 3 times, then stared out the window. The wind rustled the curtain beside her. The city moved on below her feet. And inside her, something began to bloom. She met with Everett the following week. They sat across from each other at a quiet tea shop tucked between a bookstore and a flower market. He didn't come with contracts or flashy promises, just a folder filled with ideas and a proposal to help her record a professional demo, something she could use to apply to scoring programs or submit to festivals. He spoke in plain language, like someone who understood that trust is built slowly. "I don't want to change what you do," he said. "I just want to help you preserve it, capture it in a way that others can feel it the way I did." Camille listened intently, nodding. It didn't feel like a sales pitch. It felt like someone offering her a rope she could hold on to as she climbed. They agreed to start with 3 tracks, original pieces Camille had written during the past week. She'd been staying up late at night, writing after her shifts, using the quiet hours to shape the emotions still rippling through her. Her music wasn't about impressing anymore. It was about truth, raw, imperfect, but hers. The studio was modest but warm, its walls lined with sound panels and shelves full of records. The moment Camille stepped inside, she felt an odd comfort, as if some part of her already belonged there. She sat at the studio piano, adjusted the headphones and took a deep breath. Everett was behind the glass, giving her a thumbs up, no pressure in his gaze. She began to play. This time, there was no audience, no clapping, no spotlight, just Camille and the music, and that was enough. As the recording sessions continued over the following weeks, her life quietly began to evolve. She still worked at the cafe, though her hours shifted to accommodate her studio time. Her co-workers, once casual acquaintances, became unexpected cheerleaders. Matteo printed out the arts blog article and pinned it behind the staff area. The manager asked if she'd consider playing during the slow Saturday brunches. Even some of the regular customers began bringing friends just to hear her. But with new recognition came new challenges. Dorian Holt hadn't said another word publicly since that night, but his presence still lingered like the aftertaste of something sour. Camille saw him one more time briefly, about 2 weeks after the video went viral. He walked past the cafe during a lunch rush, slowed when he saw her through the window, then kept walking. No wave, no smirk, just silence. And Camille felt nothing. Not bitterness, not triumph, just detachment. He was no longer a character in her story. And yet, she often thought about the moment he dared her to play, about how humiliation turned into rebirth. Sometimes the catalyst for our biggest transformation is the very thing meant to diminish us. She didn't thank him, she didn't need to. His role was done. Camille's life began to take on a rhythm she hadn't experienced in years. A rhythm that wasn't ruled by obligation or exhaustion, but by something closer to fulfillment. Her mornings were still early, her work shift still long, and yet her spirit felt lighter. The music had seeped back into every corner of her life, like sunlight spilling through a window long kept shut. She no longer composed in secrecy or silence. Her melodies had names now, intentions, meaning, and for the first time in her adult life, she allowed herself to imagine what a future shaped by her art might look like. One evening, while organizing receipts behind the cafe counter, she overheard two customers whispering about her, one pointing discreetly toward the piano. "That's her, right? The one who played during dinner last month? It's still going around. Someone posted a remix of it, I think." The other responded, "Honestly, it was better than most things I've seen on TV. Felt like something out of a movie." Camille felt the words wrap around her like a secret hug. She didn't turn to acknowledge them. She didn't need to. Just hearing it was enough. A week later, something unexpected happened. A woman entered the cafe with short silver hair, oversized sunglasses, and an energy that turned heads without asking for permission. She introduced herself as Madeline Shaw, a retired film producer known for championing young talent and independent creatives. She'd heard about Camille's performance through a colleague. "They said your playing made a grown man rethink his entire personality," she joked with a warm smile. "That's not easy to do." Camille laughed, unsure how to respond. Madeline continued, "I'm mentoring a few young filmmakers working on short films. They need original compositions, nothing big budget, just raw, emotional scoring. Would you be interested in submitting something?" The question didn't hit Camille like an opportunity. It hit her like a memory, a younger version of herself sitting on her bedroom floor with a worn-out keyboard and an open notebook, pretending her music would one day guide someone through a scene. This was that moment. Years delayed, yet right on time. "I'd love to," she said, her voice clear, calm, and certain. Madeline nodded, handed her a packet of briefs for the short films, and told her to feel everything, not overthink anything. Camille worked on the scores for the next 2 weeks, carefully tailoring each piece to the emotional arcs of the films. One was a quiet story about a girl reconnecting with her estranged father. Another was a poetic reflection on memory and grief. Camille didn't just write music, she wrote empathy into every note. When she submitted the final tracks, Madeline called her the next day. "Camille," she said with a tone both approving and impressed, "I don't know what kind of magic you poured into those keys, but every one of those kids cried during the screenings. That's rare, that's power." Camille sat on her apartment floor that night, notebook open, fingers hovering above her keyboard. And she cried too, not out of sadness, but out of the overwhelming reality that her dream was no longer just a dream. It was a path, a voice, a place she belonged. Meanwhile, the cafe began hosting open mic nights. It was Grace's idea, really. "You're not the only hidden artist in this city," she said. "Why not make Café Amarillo a place where people find their voice again?" Camille brought the idea to the manager, who agreed without hesitation. They started small, one Friday a month, then bi-weekly. Camille always opened the evening with a short set, then sat in the back watching poets, singers, and musicians pour their hearts into the room. Some were nervous, some were awkward, but every single one of them was brave. One night, a teenage boy played a guitar piece he wrote for his sister, who had passed away the year before. The room was silent as he played. Camille sat near the back, tears streaming quietly down her cheeks. When he finished, she clapped the loudest. Afterward, he approached her, eyes wide. "Thank you," he said. "I only played because I saw your video. I thought, if she could do it, maybe I could too." Camille didn't know what to say at first. Then she simply replied, "You did more than just play. You gave us a piece of her." That was the night she realized her story had become more than just personal. It had become a kind of permission, an invitation for others to stand up, speak out, and create from the broken and beautiful places within themselves. The momentum Camille had unknowingly ignited continued to ripple outward like soft waves in still water. What started as one vulnerable performance had become a quiet movement, an atmosphere of honesty, art, and healing. The open mic nights at Café Amarillo were now the heartbeat of something bigger than the cafe itself. People came not just to be entertained, but to feel. There was no stage, no bright lights, just a piano in the corner, a mic on a stand, and a room full of strangers willing to listen. Camille's presence during those nights was never flashy. She didn't seek applause or center stage. She simply sat, played, and gave others space to shine. But that humility became magnetic. Aspiring artists from around the city began showing up, spoken word poets who had never read aloud before, musicians who thought they'd given up years ago, and even older adults rediscovering their voices after decades of silence. The cafe transformed into something sacred, a refuge. One Friday, just before closing, a young woman approached Camille after her set. She looked no older than 20, her hands shaking slightly as she held a worn-out sketch pad to her chest. "I don't sing or play," she began, "but I draw, and I drew you as playing." She turned the pad around to reveal a charcoal sketch. Camille, at the piano, eyes closed, hair pulled back, completely lost in the music. It was raw, unpolished, but so vivid that it almost moved. Camille stared at the image, her throat tightening. "I never thought anyone would think I was worth drawing," she said softly. The young woman shrugged shyly. "I saw myself in you. That's all." Camille hugged her. Outside of the cafe, her demo with Everett had begun circulating quietly. He submitted it to a few indie scoring competitions, and while Camille didn't expect much, one morning she received an email with the subject line, "You've been selected." Her composition was chosen for the Pacific Soundtrack Showcase, an annual event that highlighted emerging composers and connected them with film professionals. It wasn't a prize, it was a platform, and that, to Camille, was everything. She flew to Seattle for the event, nervous, overwhelmed, but grounded. Grace had helped her pack, slipping a small note into Camille's bag that read, "You were never invisible. The world just finally opened its eyes." At the showcase, Camille's piece was performed by a live chamber ensemble in front of a modest audience of directors, editors, and fellow composers. As the final note faded, Camille looked around, not at the crowd, but at the musicians. They had brought her work to life. They had made her emotion real. She felt a sense of completeness she'd never known before. After the performance, a young director approached her with a business card and a script. "I'm working on a short film about growing up with a nonverbal sibling. I don't want cliché music, I want something that understands. When I heard your piece, I felt like you knew how to listen." Camille took the card with both hands, humbled. She'd been writing from her own longing all along, but now it was connecting her to the stories of others. Her music had become a conversation. Returning to Portland, she stepped off the train feeling different. Not because of fame, not because of any prize, but because she had crossed a threshold within herself. She was no longer a girl who used to dream. She was a woman living it, one note at a time. Back at Café Amarillo, things were still the same in all the right ways. The coffee still smelled like heaven. The regulars still argued over crossword puzzles. The dishwasher still leaked. But there was also a noticeable shift. The space felt alive. Camille's story had planted a seed in the community, a seed that kept growing. One afternoon, an elderly man with a cane shuffled toward the piano. He asked Camille if he could play. She nodded, stepped aside, and watched as he carefully lowered himself onto the bench. What followed was a haunting, fragile version of Moon River, played with trembling hands but unwavering heart. When he finished, the entire cafe clapped. The man looked at Camille and whispered, "First time I've played in public since my wife died. She always told me not to stop." Camille smiled, her voice soft but certain. "Then I'm glad you didn't." As weeks turned into months, Camille's world expanded in the most unexpected ways. The cafe remained her anchor, the piano her compass, and music her language. Yet what surprised her most wasn't her own growth. It was watching the quiet transformations around her. People were not just hearing her notes, they were allowing themselves to be changed by them. Camille wasn't leading a movement, but something was definitely moving. Inside the cafe, people had started coming earlier, staying longer, and leaving a little softer. The regulars now knew each other's names. Stories flowed more freely. Pain was shared, but so was laughter. It wasn't just about art anymore, it was about connection. One particularly slow afternoon, a man in his 50s stood at the counter for several minutes before ordering. He finally said, "You don't know me, but my daughter came here last month. She played guitar on open mic night. It was the first time she'd done anything like that since her anxiety got bad. She hasn't stopped playing since. You gave her that courage." Camille didn't know how to respond. She wasn't a therapist, she wasn't a teacher, but she nodded with gentle appreciation, understanding what he meant. Music doesn't heal everything, but it opens doors where walls once stood. Not long after that, Camille began teaching, informally at first. A mother who brought her young daughter every Saturday asked if Camille might give her some pointers. Then a teenager asked if he could shadow her during practice. Word spread. Soon Camille's small apartment became a sanctuary for budding musicians who didn't fit into traditional lessons. She didn't teach scales or theory the way conservatories did. Instead, she asked questions like, "What does your sadness sound like?" or "Can you play me a memory?" Her method wasn't academic, but it was transformative. These students didn't just learn how to play, they learned how to feel through sound. And in the process, Camille healed parts of herself too. Because every time she helped someone unlock their voice, she was reminded that she had never really lost hers, only hidden it, waiting for the right reason to bring it back out. One evening, during a full house at the cafe's now monthly artist showcase, Camille was invited to close the night. She hadn't planned to play. She'd spent the night supporting others, clapping and hugging and encouraging. But as the host handed her the mic and the crowd called her name, she sat down at the piano without resistance. She began with a soft improvisation, unwritten, unrehearsed. The melody was patient, like a conversation between parts of herself that had never met before. Slowly, she wove in motifs from earlier pieces, fragments of her journey, echoes of grief, joy, longing, and hope. There were no lyrics, yet the silence in the room said everyone understood. When the final note faded, the audience didn't clap immediately. They breathed, and then the applause rose, not loud or performative, but deep and reverent, a gratitude that felt personal. Camille stood, hands at her sides, and addressed the crowd. "Thank you," she said, "not just for listening tonight, but for being part of this place, for showing up, for yourselves, for each other. I used to think music was just something I did, but now I know it's who I am. And if it helped any of you remember who you are, then I'm doing what I came here to do." After the event, she stepped outside for air. The city lights blinked softly, and the hum of nighttime traffic felt less like noise and more like rhythm. Grace joined her, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders. "You've changed everything," she whispered. Camille shook her head, her voice warm but firm. "No, I just stopped hiding, and people did the rest." Camille's life didn't suddenly become a fairy tale. There were still bills to pay, dishes to wash, days when doubt crept in like a slow fog. But something fundamental had changed. She no longer saw herself as someone waiting for life to begin. She was living it. She wasn't just a woman who could play music. She was a composer, a mentor, and a voice that resonated far beyond 4 walls and 50 keys. Weeks after the showcase, Camille received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a letter printed on thick paper with gold-embossed lettering. It was from a regional arts organization inviting her to be a keynote speaker for an upcoming creative conference. Not because of fame, but because of impact. The letter read, "Your story has become a reminder that authenticity, not applause, is what transforms lives." Camille reread it 3 times. Then she closed her eyes, smiled, and whispered, "Okay." She accepted the invitation, not because she loved public speaking, but because she finally knew she had something worth saying. At the conference, she stood in front of an auditorium of aspiring artists, educators, and dreamers. She told her story, not in polished sound bites, but in truth, about growing up in a quiet town, about a grandfather who fixed her first keyboard with duct tape, about nights spent playing in the dark just to feel like herself again. She talked about fear, about the moment she was challenged not to prove herself, but to remember herself, about how the piano at a café and a mocking stranger had inadvertently opened the door to everything she'd been hiding. "But this," she said to the audience, "was never about revenge. It was about reclamation. You don't owe your brilliance to those who doubt you. You owe it to yourself. Play anyway." The room erupted, not in shouts, but in nods, wet eyes, and the quiet clap of hearts cracking open. After the speech, people came up to her, not to praise her, but to share. A woman whispered about a book she hadn't touched in years. A man confessed he used to paint before his divorce made him forget how to feel. A student hugged Camille and said, "I thought I was too broken to be creative. Now I think maybe I'm just starting." Camille returned to Portland, feeling fuller than ever, not just because of where she'd been, but because of where she was going. The calls and offers came slowly but surely, an invitation to compose for a documentary, a chance to mentor at a summer music camp, a collaboration with a local dance troupe. Nothing glittery, everything real. But she still came back to Café Amarillo every week. She still played on Friday nights, still poured coffee when needed, still sat with her students on the floor of her apartment and asked, "What story are you telling with this note?" Because for Camille, it wasn't about escaping where she came from. It was about weaving it into where she was headed. Her roots weren't anchors. They were threads, and they made the music richer. And now, if you're still here, maybe you've felt something in Camille's story that mirrors a part of yours. So let me ask you something. What is it that you've been quietly good at but too afraid to share? What melody or message or masterpiece have you left sitting in the back corner of your life? I'd love to hear it in the comments, because your voice matters. Whether you're ready to stand in the spotlight or still finding your rhythm, this community is for you. And if Camille's journey reminded you of your own resilience, or maybe gave you permission to dream again, hit that subscribe button. Not for me, for you. So the next story reminds you that you're never too late, never too forgotten, and always just one brave moment away from everything you've been waiting for. Share your story below. Tell us what moved you, what you're working on, what fear you're ready to leave behind. Let's fill this space with hope, truth, and music that can't be silenced. Because like Camille said, it was never about proving anything to them. It was about finally playing for yourself.